In the mid-1660s, Elizabeth Cresswell was a notorious figure in London's underworld, famed for being one of the most successful madams in the city. And with her links to members of the aristocracy, and even King Charles II, authorities couldn't touch her. Yet this wouldn't last forever, and her downfall and imprisonment came in quick succession, owing to none other than her own lover. Join me to find out why. Elizabeth Cresswell was born in the village of Knockholt in Kent in southeastern England in 1625, the same year that King Charles I succeeded to the thrones of England, Scotland and Ireland. Little did Elizabeth know that much of her later life would be shaped by Britain's royal politics. She did not hail from a poor family, as was typical of the majority of those who ended up working in London's sex industry in the 17th century. Rather, the Cresswells were a solid gentry family, middle class by modern standards, and of firm Protestant convictions. They also had ties to the Percival family, whose origins were in Kent and who carved out large estates in Ireland in the 17th century, ties which linked the Cresswells to the royal court. Her teenage years were ones of chaos, as war broke out across Charles I's kingdoms from the late 1630s onwards, culminating in a lengthy civil war in England throughout the 1640s. It was only with the execution of the king by Parliament in 1649 that the conflict came to an end. By that time, many gentry families across England, like the Cresswells, had lost fathers and sons in the fighting, leaving widows and daughters impoverished, particularly if they had supported the defeated royalist cause. And this development would play an important role in Elizabeth's later life. While little is known about Cresswell's activities in the 1640s, we know that in the 1650s she was living in Shoreditch and had begun operating a brothel on Bartholomew Close, a narrow side street in the Little Britain neighbourhood of London. She was arrested for doing so in 1658, and the ensuing court case created quite a scandal. Residents of Little Britain appeared as witnesses and testified to the extent of the business Cresswell was overseeing at Bartholomew Close, which was on a scale that the daughters of local residents were assumed to be prostitutes simply for being in proximity to Cresswell's establishment. The angry locals stated that she did entertain diverse loose persons, men and women, suspected to have committed bawdry, the said Elizabeth having lately taken a house for which she paid £100 for a fine and a rent of £40 per annum, whereunto many persons well habited have resorted by day and by night, continued drinking, ranting, dancing, revelling, swearing, demeaning themselves as well on the Lord's Day and fast days. Witnesses told of seeing men and women going into rooms, the woman having, stripped to her bodice and petticoat, going into a room where they have shut the casement and locked the door. Some company drunk about a dozen bottles of wine, and further that divers women suspected of lightness have, did surreptitiously slip in at a back gate whereby much infamy is brought upon the place. Despite her best efforts to bribe officials to keep the story out of the newsletters and pamphlets, which was sold in the courtyard of St. Paul's Cathedral, Cresswell's case became a cause célèbre in the city, and she was found guilty and sentenced to hard labour in the notorious Bridewell prison. It should be noted that Cresswell was playing with fire by running a brothel in London in the 1650s. The victory of the parliamentarians over the royalists in the 1640s had ushered in a republic known as the Commonwealth, one which was dominated by the Puritans, an austere and extremely conservative branch of the English Protestantism. Under their influence, England became a place where sexual liberty was massively curtailed in the 1650s, and women like Cresswell were punished severely for their activities if caught. Yet, all of that would change shortly after Cresswell was sent to Bridewell prison. In 1659, the son and heir of the executed King Charles I, who was living in The Hague in the Low Countries at the time, was contacted by a cohort of English nobles who offered to help restore the monarchy. A few months later in 1660, he returned to England and was crowned as King Charles II. The Restoration period, as the 1660s and 1670s became known after King Charles II returned from exile in continental Europe, was one of partying and sexual license after the gloomy years of the interregnum of the 1640s and 1650s. Unsurprisingly, Cresswell was quickly released from Bridewell prison, and by the mid-1660s, she had expanded her operations and was running numerous brothels all over London. These included one near Lincoln Fields, another by Cripplegate, and a third operating out of a mansion by Clerkenwell. Cresswell even had an office to oversee her operations from in Millbank, and agents who travelled around England to scout out young women to work in her establishments. Often, these came from gentry families which had lost fathers and brothers in the wars of the 1640s and 1650s, and which were left destitute as a result. By this time, there was little possibility of Cresswell being impeded in her activities. Her clients included many members of the aristocracy, and even King Charles II, a serial philanderer who had many mistresses over the years and fathered over a dozen illegitimate children. We also know that Cresswell's network of women generally came from the richer classes due to the fact that they were known as the Countesses of the Exchange, as they plied their trade on Gresham Street by the Royal Exchange, the stock market of 17th century London. With links to the king, senior aristocrats and the city's richest bankers and merchants, Cresswell was all but untouchable by the authorities in the 1660s. While Cresswell had little to fear from the government and the courts, the Puritans were still a problem. Early in 1668, Charles II, a tepid Protestant who toyed with conversion to Catholicism throughout his reign, issued a decree that radical Protestants and Puritans could not worship in their homes and unofficial congregations henceforth. Thousands of Puritans, now known as dissenters for dissenting from the established church, refused to accept this, and during the Easter week in 1668, they engaged in violent riots across London in protests against the government. Brothels like those which Cresswell operated in the city became a precise target of the dissenters, as they claimed that it was ludicrous that they could not worship in the manner that they wished, but Cresswell and other brothel owners could run their business freely in the capital. Consequently, numerous brothels in London were attacked, and many were ransacked and burned, so leading to the riots becoming known as the Bawdy Street Riots. Cresswell's brothels were particularly targeted by the rioters, owing to her known ties to the king. At one of her brothels in Moorfields, for instance, the women who worked there were attacked by the rioters, and the building was looted and vandalised to the extent that no business could be conducted there without serious repairs, including replacing the bedding, which was ripped up. Beds were expensive commodities in the 17th century, so this hit Cresswell financially. Cresswell did not take this assault on her establishments lying down. In the weeks that followed, she combined with Damaris Page, another highly successful London madam and brothel operator, who ran several establishments near the Tower of London and in Stepney, ones which captured the mariner's business by what were the London docks at the time. Together, the pair decided to put together a petition requesting that they be reimbursed for the money they would now have to spend on repairing their establishments by the government. It seems probable that an unidentified pamphleteer was hired to put together the text of this petition, which was subsequently published in London with the rather self-effacing title, The Horse Petition. The Horse Petition was addressed to a specific person, a not unusual thing for authors to do with pamphlets which are published through the London press in the 17th century. The addressee was none other than the Countess of Castlemaine, Barbara Palmer, Charles II's longtime mistress, with whom he had fathered 5 illegitimate children by 1668. Cresswell and Page requested Castlemaine, who was known for her libertine lifestyle and considerable promiscuity, to act on behalf of her quote, sisters, and use her influence over King Charles to convince him to provide funding for the re-establishment of London's brothels. The Horse Petition is viewed today as probably being a literary joke. Cresswell and Page can hardly have expected that the king would intervene publicly to provide government funding for the rebuilding of the capital's brothels, and so the text may have been designed to taunt the dissenters and Puritans who had caused the Bawdy Street riots to begin with. In the end, it was not the dissenters who would be the ruin of Cresswell, but her own dalliances and political affiliations. It was well known in London throughout the 1670s that Cresswell was involved in a relationship with Sir Thomas Player. Player hailed from an established family of drapers and merchants in Kent, and his family may have been acquainted with the Cresswells, who lived nearby when he and Elizabeth were growing up. His father had been a firm supporter of the parliamentary cause during the Civil Wars, and had been subsequently made Chamberlain of the City of London in 1651, a post which Player succeeded to upon his father's death. By the late 1660s, Player had emerged as a thorn in Charles II's side, one who created problems for the king over his tepid Protestantism and suspicions that the king was a crypto-Catholic. Player also favoured Parliament being the dominant political power in England, rather than the monarchy. Thus, when Elizabeth began associating with Player in the 1670s, she was playing with political fire. The pair soon became notorious in the capital. It was widely believed that Cresswell and Player hosted orgies at her home in Camberwell, south of London, yet this was most likely just gossip. Whatever the truth of this, what was true was that Cresswell and Player hosted banquets and gatherings for Player's political allies at her home in Camberwell, and these were quite rightly viewed as being meetings of opponents of the king. This was compounded when Player, who was a Member of Parliament, became a central figure in efforts to exclude Charles's brother James, Duke of York, from the succession in the late 1670s. Well, despite Charles having fathered many sons and daughters, around 14 in total, none had been born in wedlock, and were thus illegitimate and unable to succeed him as king. Throughout these years, Elizabeth also provided funding to Player, who had lost most of his wealth in the mid-1670s on the back of poor investments with London's merchants. As a result of all of this, Player became known at the time as Sir Thomas Creswell. All of this ensured that by the early 1680s, Elizabeth no longer enjoyed the kind of immunity from official scrutiny that she had back in the 1660s and early 1670s when the king himself had been a client of hers. Instead, she was increasingly viewed by the king and his court as an affiliate of Charles's political opponents. It is no surprise then to find that in 1681, Cresswell was finally hauled before the courts in London and charged with, quote, over 30 years of bawdry. The timing was revelatory. Just weeks earlier, Player had stepped up the pressure on the monarchy by calling for a public investigation into the so-called Popish Plot, a fictitious conspiracy which hardline Protestants such as Player and his ally Titus Oates had created in 1678 to stir up anti-Catholic sentiment and opposition to the king and his brother. Evidently, the authorities decided to move against Cresswell a few weeks later as a way of attacking Player. In the resulting trial, many women who had worked in Elizabeth's brothels over the years testified against her. As a result, her brothel in the Moorfields was closed and the property taken into Crown ownership, but her other businesses were left largely untouched. Clearly, Charles was firing a warning shot here. He did not destroy Cresswell, but he had the courts launch enough of an investigation and a trial to scare her away from her current political associations. By the time she was put on trial in 1681, Cresswell was into the second half of her 50s, and heading into old age by the standards of the 17th century. By the time the Dutch engraver Marcellus Leroux engraved a portrait of her for his publication, The Cries of London, in the mid-1680s, she was already suffering from tuberculosis and had aged drastically. Yet she never dissented from her field of work and was eventually arrested again in the early 1690s, as a new Protestant austerity was enforced following the accession of Mary II and William III. The time of her death is unknown, yet some sources place her death at some point around 1698, and we do know that she died in Bridewell Prison in London. Given her prominent role in London's social scene for a period of over 3 decades, Cresswell became a feature of literary works on the London stage, both in her own time and after her death. For instance, one of the great libertines of the age, John Wilmot, 2nd Earl of Rochester, referenced her in his satirical poems, numerous pamphlets, and broadsides specifically mentioned her in the 1670s and 1680s, while as late as the 1720s, Daniel Defoe, author of Robinson Crusoe, used her as an inspiration for the titular character of his novel, Moll Flanders. Thank you everyone so much for watching this video on Elizabeth Cresswell. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of her life down below in the comments, and if you have any other suggestions, also leave them in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. And anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.